March 1955, Burbank, California. A 23-year-old actor walked onto a Warner Brothers soundstage, picked up a red nylon jacket and put it on. He did not know in that moment that he was putting on the most iconic costume in the history of American cinema. He did not know that 70 years later, that jacket would be displayed in museums, replicated in every corner of the world, worn by teenagers on every continent who had never seen the film it came from. He did not know that the image of him in that jacket, hands in pockets, dark hair falling forward, a look on his face somewhere between defiance and devastation, would become one of the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century. He just put it on, and it fit him the way nothing had ever fit him before. The film was Rebel Without a Cause. The director was Nicholas Ray. The role was Jim Stark, a teenager in a new town, misunderstood by his parents, drawn to a group of equally lost young people trying to find some way to live inside a world that seemed to have been built for someone else entirely. James Dean read the script and did not need to prepare. He already knew Jim Stark. He had been Jim Stark. In certain ways, he had never stopped being Jim Stark, the boy who needed something from the adults around him and could never find a way to ask for it that they were capable of answering. What happened over the next 3 months of filming would produce not just a great movie, but a cultural earthquake. A film that would define a generation, create an archetype that has never been replaced, and make James Dean's face as recognizable as any face in the history of popular culture. And it would be finished and in theaters before the year was out. Because James Dean was 23 years old and moving fast, always moving fast, as though some part of him understood, without being able to say it clearly, that time was not something he had in unlimited supply. This is Episode 4, The Red Jacket, The Chicken Run, The Rooftop. The night America met the rebel it had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. The story of Rebel Without a Cause begins not with James Dean, but with a director named Nicholas Ray, and a question that Ray had been circling for years without being able to answer it cleanly. Ray was one of the most distinctive filmmakers of the 1950s. He had a particular obsession with outsiders, people who did not fit the structures society had built and could not pretend convincingly that they did. His previous films had explored violence, loneliness, and the enormous gap between the America that existed in advertisements and political speeches and the America that existed in actual living rooms and actual lives. He understood more clearly than most filmmakers of his era that post-war prosperity had solved certain problems and quietly created entirely new ones that nobody yet had the language to describe. He had been developing Rebel Without a Cause for several years, working from a 1944 psychological study about juvenile delinquency and expanding it into something far larger and more personal. The film Ray wanted to make was not really about delinquency at all. It was about the specific pain of being young in post-war America, materially comfortable, spiritually adrift, surrounded by parents who had survived the Depression and the war, and had no remaining emotional bandwidth for children who seemed, from the outside, to have everything they could possibly need. The teenagers in Ray's film were not poor. They were not abused in obvious ways. They were something more difficult to name and therefore more difficult to defend against, lost in the way that people are lost when no one around them has the vocabulary for what they are feeling. Angry without a clear target, lonely in houses full of people, searching for something solid to hold on to in a world that kept offering them comfort instead of meaning. Ray needed an actor who could carry that specific and subtle weight, who could stand in front of a camera and communicate an ache that had no simple cause and no simple cure, not the clean suffering of poverty or violence or injustice, something murkier and more modern than that, the overwhelming, suffocating pressure of being young and alive and full of feeling in a world that kept telling you, in 100 quiet ways, that your feelings were inconvenient and excessive and best kept to yourself. He had been unable to find that actor. He had looked at dozens of young men. None of them had it. Not in the way he needed, not in the place inside themselves where it had to live to be believable on screen. When East of Eden screened for Ray, he sat in the dark and watched James Dean crumple in that particular way, the reaching hands, the face collapsing, the grief that was too large and too real to be contained by the fiction around it, and Ray understood immediately that he had been looking for this person. He called Warner Brothers the same night and said he wanted James Dean for Rebel Without a Cause. He was not willing to discuss alternatives. Production began in March 1955. James Dean arrived on set simultaneously as one of the most talked about new actors in America. East of Eden had just opened to enormous critical response. And still, in practical terms, a 23-year-old with exactly one film to his name. He threw himself into the preparation with the same consuming intensity he brought to everything. He worked with the costume department on Jim Stark's look, not the tailored clothes of a conventional movie star, but something more real, more everyday, more like what an actual American teenager in 1955 wore. Blue jeans, worn soft from use, a plain white t-shirt, and the red jacket. The jacket was not a wardrobe department flourish or a director's visual concept imposed from above. It was a character decision that Dean participated in shaping from the beginning. Red for visibility, this is a boy who wants desperately to be seen even as he pretends he doesn't care about being seen. Red for danger, red for the heat of everything Jim Stark is carrying inside him that no one around him will acknowledge or make room for. Red because this boy cannot be invisible no matter how much the adults in his life wish he would be quiet and conventional and grateful for the comfortable life they have provided. Dean understood this instinctively. He wore the jacket through rehearsals. He wore it between takes, walking the lot, eating lunch, sitting in his trailer going over the next day's pages. He moved in it for weeks until it stopped being a costume and started being a second skin, until the particular way he stood and walked and held his shoulders inside it communicated an entire psychology that no written line of dialogue could have produced alone. The jacket became an extension of his body. The body became an extension of the character. By the time cameras rolled on the first principal photography days, there was no visible scene between James Dean and Jim Stark. They had become, for the duration of filming, the same person. Nicholas Ray watched this happen over the first weeks of production and said later it was unlike anything he had witnessed in his career. Other skilled actors built their characters from the outside in, observing, constructing, layering detail upon detail until a coherent human being emerged. Dean worked from the inside out, finding the emotional truth first and letting the exterior details arrange themselves around it. He located the places where Jim Stark's history overlapped with James Dean's history. The absent father, the desperate hunger to belong to something real, the anger that had no single clean address, and he expanded those places until they filled the entire role completely. The result on screen is a performance that does not look like acting because, in the deepest and most important sense, it was not entirely acting. It was a young man telling the truth about himself through the protective structure of a fictional character's name. The fiction gave him permission. The truth was entirely his own. But Rebel Without a Cause required more than emotional authenticity. It required James Dean to put his body into situations that were genuinely dangerous, and to make that physical danger feel on screen like the precise external expression of everything Jim Stark was carrying internally. The most famous action sequence in the film was the chicken run. 2 teenagers, 2 stolen cars, a cliff above the Pacific Ocean. The challenge, drive toward the edge at full speed and jump from the car before it goes over. The last one to jump is the winner, the one who cannot bring himself to jump, the one who hesitates a fraction of a second. What the chicken run required emotionally was a very specific kind of desperation. Jim Stark does not want to die, but he cannot back down. Not because of adolescent pride, not because he is performing toughness for an audience, but because this challenge has given him something extraordinarily rare in his daily life. A moment in which the rules are completely clear, the stakes are absolutely real, and the outcome depends entirely on himself. No parents involved, no disappointed expectations, no one else's idea of who he should be. Just the car and the cliff and the choice. In the confusion and suffocation of everything else in Jim Stark's life, the simplicity of that is almost a relief. Dean understood that with his entire body, not just his mind, and the sequence on screen has a quality of genuine aliveness of a young man who is truly, completely present in the moment rather than illustrating it from a safe distance, that manufactured danger never produces and cannot fake. But the sequence that most defined Rebel Without a Cause, the one that teenagers across America carried with them for the rest of their lives, was not the chicken run. It was quieter than that, more intimate, devastating in the way that only very quiet things can be devastating. It is the scene on the rooftop of the Griffith Observatory, late at night, after the chaos of the evening has burned itself out, and what remains is just three young people sitting in the dark above Los Angeles, being honest with each other in the way that young people sometimes manage to be when the adults are gone, and the performance is no longer required. Jim Stark sits with Judy, played by Natalie Wood, and with Plato, the youngest and most vulnerable of the three, played by Sal Mineo. Each of them comes from a different kind of broken home. Each carries a different kind of wound, and sitting together on that rooftop in the dark, they allow themselves carefully and briefly to imagine what they actually want their lives to look like. What they want is devastatingly simple: a place to belong. People who understand them without requiring them to explain and justify themselves first. A home that feels like an actual home, warm, safe, honest, rather than a performance of one. Rest from the exhausting daily work of pretending to be fine when they are not fine, have never been fine, and are running out of the energy required to keep pretending. Dean plays this scene with a stillness that took a lifetime of real experience to produce. The defiance that the red jacket carries through the film's earlier sequences has drained away completely. What remains is a young man, genuinely tired, sitting in the dark and allowing himself, for a few unguarded minutes, to want something without immediately armoring himself against the possibility of not getting it. It is the most vulnerable moment in the film. It is, many critics have written in the decades since, among the most vulnerable moments any actor produced on screen in the entire decade of the 1950s. Natalie Wood plays opposite him with equal precision and equal openness. The chemistry between them is real, built over weeks on set of genuine friendship, genuine mutual recognition between two people who had each grown up too fast inside an industry that asked a great deal and protected very little. Every teenager who saw that rooftop scene in 1955 recognized themselves in it immediately. And every person watching this video right now would say, if they are honest, recognized it once too, in a theater that may no longer be standing. In a body 50 years younger than the one they are in today, sitting in the dark, with their own version of that particular longing that James Dean had finally given a face and a voice and a red jacket. He gave them the image, and they held it for 70 years without letting go. Rebel Without a Cause premiered in New York City on October 27, 1955. James Dean was not there. He had been dead for 27 days. On September 30th, 1955, while Rebel Without a Cause was in post-production, while the studio was finalizing the marketing campaign, while Nicholas Ray was making his last editing decisions, James Dean climbed into his Porsche 550 Spyder on a California highway and drove toward an intersection in the fading afternoon light. The collision lasted less than a second. It ended everything. He was 24 years old. He had made 3 films. He had been famous for exactly 8 months. The audience that filled the premiere theater had been living for nearly a month with the knowledge that the young man on the screen was already gone. They were watching a ghost, a young man, preserved forever at 23, captured at the precise moment of his maximum beauty and his maximum emotional honesty, unable to age or disappoint or become anything other than exactly what he was in those frames. The rooftop scene hit the premiere audience in a way that no one present was fully prepared for, because they knew, watching Jim Stark dare to want something, watching him sit in the dark and allow himself to hope, that James Dean had not made it. That the young man who had put every genuine, undefended part of himself into this role had 27 days left to live, when those scenes were filmed. The film was a massive commercial and critical success. It earned Academy Award nominations and defined the decade. It made an entire generation of young Americans feel, for the very first time, that someone in the culture had looked directly at them and said, "I see you. I know exactly what you are feeling. You are not alone in this, and you are not wrong for feeling it." And James Dean, qui est earth, who never attended the premiere, who never saw the line stretching around the block, who never read a single one of the reviews, became exactly what he had decided to become on that farm in Fairmount, Indiana, more than a decade before. Impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. Eternal. Rebel Without a Cause made James Dean not just a movie star, but a permanent symbol of youth, of longing, of the specific American ache of being full of feeling in a world that keeps asking you to be quiet and grateful and fine. The red jacket became the most recognizable costume in the history of cinema. His face appeared on posters in every country on Earth, and it is still there today, still 23 years old, still looking at you with that expression that says, "I know, I feel it too." You are not alone. He had one film left, Giant, the biggest production of his career, filmed in the scorching Texas heat alongside Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor, a performance that many who saw it believed was his greatest work of all. He would not live to see it released. Episode 5, Giant, the last performance, the last morning, the last drive, and September 30th, 1955, the day that stopped a generation in its tracks and made James Dean permanent forever. This is Legends of America. Think about what James Dean had built in 8 months. 8 months from the East of Eden premiere to the night the Rebel Without a Cause audience sat in that theater, knowing he was gone. 8 months of being the most talked about young actor in America. 8 months of magazine covers and fan letters and studio executives who had once called him too strange, now calling him the future of Hollywood. 8 months, that was all he got. And yet the strange, almost unbearable truth is this: it was enough. Not enough for him. Not enough for the people who loved him or the generation that needed him, but enough to make him permanent. Enough to ensure that the face and the jacket and the expression would outlast every single person who had ever doubted him, every casting director who had ever turned him away, every studio executive who had ever called him difficult. The boy who had been told he was too internal, too unconventional, too much, turned out to be exactly enough. More than enough. He was the only one who had ever been exactly right. Jim Stark on that rooftop asking for something real. Cal Trask reaching for a father who could not reach back. Both of them James Dean. All of it James Dean. The wound and the longing and the refusal to pretend it didn't hurt. Your generation carried him. You were teenagers when that red jacket appeared on screen, and something in you recognized it immediately, and not as a costume, not as a movie star's prop, but as a feeling you had been living inside without having a name for it. He gave it a name. He gave it a face, and 70 years later, you have never put it down. That is not nostalgia. That is something more serious than nostalgia. That is a young man who told the truth so completely, so without protection, that the truth outlived him by 7 decades and is still alive today. One film left, one morning left, one road left. Episode 5 is next.